Welcome to the weekly duck migration forecast, episode 5 for pretty much the first week of November. We'll jump right into it with a really good question from one of our viewers. Remember to email questions at weeklyduckmigrationforecast@gmail.com. I'll check those weekly and do my best to answer them directly. This week, Daniel from Kentucky asks, I've heard and read a few places that ducks will tend to stage or move to or be located on the east to southeast of a dip in the jet stream. Do you think this is accurate, or is it just occurring due to the birds positioned ahead of an incoming front? I went on to a really good page for weather called windy.com. I'll show that to you here in a second. This is a cold front. This is a cold front that's coming next week, early next week, actually, into the Midwest. And I think this really kind of explains the bird migration, especially if you're in the Mississippi and Atlantic flyway, that birds are east or southeast of a front. The majority of our cold air comes from the northwest and dips into the mid-continent. And as such, we get a lot of birds that move east of a front or to the southeast direction ahead of one of these fronts. Sometimes birds will wait it out, and then we get ice conditions that make the birds move. Very often, on clear nights, there's research also that shows that these birds are moving on these really clear nights with favorable winds, which to a large degree, lots of times are these really strong northwest winds as a cold high pressure system zooms towards the Atlantic coast to equilibrate with a low pressure system. If we also look to the northwest of the Great Lakes, we see a chain of glacial lakes, and birds follow these, especially birds headed towards the Atlantic coast, follow these very strongly. So these birds on a good clear night with a northwest wind will make movements towards the southeast. Some really good research by colleagues of mine at Forbes Biological Station in Illinois found that birds generally are not migrating on nights that have really hard precipitation or anything. Those are difficult conditions. But clear conditions, either ahead or behind these cold fronts moving to the south and east, are fairly typical. I don't feel that there's any science that I could find that says they migrate ahead of or behind. I think, anecdotally and just thinking about the ecology of these birds, if they are in condition to move and there's a strong pressure system coming that they can detect, it is likely that they may move out ahead of these fronts. Sometimes they sit through that weather, and then you might get some icing and some poor foraging conditions for them and plummeting temperatures that thereafter on any given night, and they are mostly migrating at night, right? There are some day migrations, but mostly they're moving at night. And they may move behind those fronts once conditions deteriorate as well, but not during the front for the most part. So Daniel, I hope that answers your question. There is not a lot of science specifically on these movements, but given the weather patterns and the directionality of the majority of the weather that comes across the mid-continent and towards the Mississippi and Atlantic flyway, this is my general reasoning for the patterns that you are seeing. So I'll jump into the summary for this week. We're looking at really mild temperatures in the Mississippi flyway. The Dakotas thawed out. The snow melted, the wetlands thawed, and the ducks that did not leave seem to have redistributed and are hanging out. Late in the week, into next week, it looks like a cold high pressure system. You saw that in the last slide. Sets up in the west, which may bring another burst of cold air that's great enough to cause a good number of ducks to migrate south. Places like Iowa, Illinois, the composition of ducks has changed largely, seemingly to a percentage of mallards. And so many of those early migrating dabbling ducks are from Iowa south, following those cold fronts last week. And even, places as far south as Tennessee are actually seeing good numbers of mallards. That cold shot made birds move really nicely for early in the season relative to what we've kind of seen in the past. So there's a good distribution of ducks as hopefully as seasons open at mid latitudes that folks can take advantage of. Again, most of those are your early migrating dabbling ducks like Gadwall and Wigeon, shovelers, pintails. Mallards are kind of hanging back a little bit as would be expected. At northern latitudes in the Atlantic flyway, the general abundance of early migrating dabbling ducks is decreasing and expected to continue kind of for them to trickle out in this coming week as they move south, especially early in the week. There's some snowy conditions in the Great Lakes region right now, and it's not that there aren't these early migrating dabbling ducks around. Folks are still getting into Wigeon and Pintail and green-wings and such. But there's much lower numbers of them, especially where skim ice occurred, and there was a pretty good movement out late last week and in the weekend. So folks, Maryland, New Jersey-ish latitude, Delaware should be starting to see some birds move in at this time. Not much that's really made mallards move at this point. And later in the week, temperatures are going to reach nearly 65 degrees in the Great Lakes region, which I expect will really stall migration. So doing your homework, getting some good shots early in the morning is going to be your real opportunity there. So my best bet for the Mississippi Flyway would be to focus on late in the week, and my best bet for the Atlantic Flyway would be to fire it up. And if you're not out today in the conditions that are occurring, very windy, tomorrow and Wednesday, definitely. Thursday, Friday is going to probably really stall. We'll look at river gauges at the end of this, and the recent rains have again increased river heights in the southeast. I don't know how much higher a lot of those can go, but that rain and recent wet and senescing or shutting down of plants that are no longer taking up water in wetlands has started to help recover some drought-stricken areas of the Great Lakes region. But there are still a lot of wetlands that remain dry, that grew great duck food, that just don't have water in them right now. If we don't get it during the season here, at some point with a snow and a melt, those will be excellent places for ducks to feed on spring migration going back to fuel them for migration and reproduction. So we should never look at those dry wetlands as the bad thing. They end up filling up with snow and that snow melt in spring. So let's jump into the tables. Not a lot of blue going on for mallard and black duck. So again, I don't expect a lot of movement. There was some movement out of the Dakotas again into that Iowa, Illinois latitude. They trickled further down. Some of them made a larger jump. In the east, we've seen a decline in the number of mallards for the most part on a lot of our areas. Those birds that moved in early on just those initial movements that aren't about weather, they either got smart or they got shot for the most part, and we haven't seen a substantial movement of any new birds. So heading towards the Atlantic flyway, this is where we start to get stale at this Great Lakes latitude where, our November lull happens and the early dabbling ducks have moved out and the black ducks and mallards haven't moved in yet. Getting over to Pintail, still expecting some movement. There was a lot of good movement last week, especially if you look over in the Mississippi flyway. And I would even say those few blue colors there at the latitude of central New York moved a lot of pintails out. Folks are still seeing them, but my expectation is a good number of them moved last week and will move early this week as well into southern latitudes, move into mid latitudes, kind of south of the Great Lakes region. For Gadwall, this is another group. If we look at that latitude of Iowa, they had a long stretch of conditions that would have moved some of those birds out. Again, in the east, we're starting to see those trickle out, but late in the week we'll get moderation where whatever we have that still remains here is what we've got. Again, shoveler, relatively similar. We do see some, little further south. These are less tolerant birds, so some movement a little further south of these birds into. I would expect they're starting to even show up, northern Arkansas, northern Mississippi, Memphis type latitude at this time. And then the ones that are really making a move that we're seeing a real decline in are Wigeon and Green-winged teal. I'd say I saw almost a probably five-fold decrease in these birds. We got some added increase from the north when some moved south, but not a lot. And then green-winged teal, the ones that I saw on Saturday in the east were relatively stale, and it didn't look like there were a lot of new naive birds showing up. So a lot of these birds have moved into southern latitudes, and or at least mid latitudes at this point. And now we're just waiting for that push of colder air that moves, much further south into mid latitudes to dump them into southern latitude. They've trickled down the flyway, well ahead of a lot of these other species because they don't tolerate the cold as much. But if we look comparison to 2019, if we look at this comparison to 2019 with Wigeon and Green-winged teal that have this threshold of WSI of -10, which is relatively mild. In 2019, we kind of went exponential. Right after this point, I forecast this out 7 more days from now, and in 2019, we went exponential with weather severity, and these birds got completely out of town in the central New York region down the Atlantic Flyway. But 2020, yeah, we're past the threshold, but it looks like it's turning around. So whatever Wigeon and Green-winged teal we have may stick around. Now, how long they stick around, I guess, is the question. When we look at the Mississippi Flyway at the latitude of Des Moines, Iowa, I did the same thing. I forecasted out 2019 a little bit further for 7 days. And there's a real big turnaround in the weather severity index for these birds. So again, whatever birds are around are probably going to stick it out for the coming week. Where in 2019 it really changed quickly. We'll have to see what happens next week. I'll talk about some long-term forecasting stuff here. I'm not ready to stick my neck out yet, but it looks like November might be. My prediction is that it'll be relatively mild, and we won't see this really strong uptick in weather severity indices. So we may see birds wherever they're at now kind of hang out and get stale pretty quick in November. Again, here's river gauges. Last week, a lot of browns and reds for extreme drought conditions in the Northeast that have kind of disappeared. I mean, there's obviously still droughty areas, and there's some drought areas in the Midwest as well. But it looks to be this is kind of what we expect this time of year, is to get back to November, December, as long as it doesn't freeze in the Northeast and upper Midwest, can get into some good flood conditions that can hold birds. As seasons start to open at mid-latitudes, if you're in these really wet areas, remember there's going to be a lot of places birds can go. So they may be there, but they just may not be cooperative because they have a lot of choices. Looking at Siberian snow cover from my friend at Atmospheric Environmental Research, Judah Cohen. If you go back to episode 1, if you haven't listened to any of these, go back to episode 1 and listen. The advance of Siberian snow cover, which you see the snow cover on the right, and then on the left is 2020 advance of snow cover in square kilometers relative to other years. What happens here is that the snow cover sets up a cold high and affects pressure systems and the opportunity for a polar vortex disruption, which can actually have cold air pour over the Mississippi and Atlantic flyways, which is helpful for migration. So we look at these global types of climate systems to understand what may happen with duck migration in the east. So we're well behind schedule for Eurasian snow cover, which suggest or has suggested in the past a relatively mild winter, and that's going to start affecting our late December, January stuff. So this is of importance to our southern hunters. Cohen has not put out his long-term winter forecast yet, but I expect it to be coming soon based on this snow advance index that he uses. What's going on right now and is expected over the next 2 weeks, if we look at this really strong low pressure system centered over the Arctic, what's happening is that we're getting a strong polar vortex, which means that cold air is circulating at the pole. There is no strong disruption by lows and highs. And so the expectation is, at least for eastern North America and the Mississippi and Atlantic flyway, that we're not going to see over the next 2 weeks. It is not predicted to have anything indicative of a strong cold outbreak for the next 2 weeks. If this continues, this strong polar vortex continues to set up, this may be an indication of a relatively mild winter for the whole entire year. I'm not at the point of sticking my neck out yet again and saying what December and January are going to look like, but I'm going to do that relatively soon here, probably next week. Arctic sea ice also affects the pressure systems, and right now the Arctic is extremely has extremely low extent of sea ice and is pumping a lot of warm air into the atmosphere and really not helping create any polar vortex disruption at this point. Oddly warm, and looks like the what cold air there is locked at the poles. But the Arctic sea ice extent, a lot of climatologists just look at what's going on there, the lack of it. It's just a really warm planet. So it's going to take a long time for us to probably just enter winter at all this year. So that's this week's weekly duck migration forecast. Email me your questions. I appreciate them. They're good questions. Keep them coming. Really easy to remember. It's weekly duck migration forecast at gmail.com. Subscribe to this YouTube channel. That'll help you get those updates. I'm going to do these weekly until the end of January. And I think I'm going to be comfortable next week to give the long-term late season forecast. So definitely tune in to episode 6, which will cover the second full week of November. And what I will do in that is look at global climate patterns and where we're at, and project out what weather is going to look like for December and January for our southern friends that are looking to hunt mostly in that late period. I already put out an early season forecast or prediction, which to date is, other than the one cold shot up north, has been relatively true, especially for the Atlantic flyway. But I'll look at what the weather patterns are telling us, and I will produce a long-term late season forecast next week. So everybody have a good week. Be safe out there. Enjoy the birds that are showing up, and shoot straight. Thanks very much.